Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to show you a brand new and easy way how we can access our private AKS cluster. The plan for today is that we're going to create a private cluster, then we're going to deploy Azure Bastion. Afterwards we're gonna configure a VNet so we can access from our Azure Bastion our AKS cluster, and in the end we're going to test the access. As always, I will mark the chapters so you can skip ahead if you already have a cluster, for example. And if you're interested in the slides, you can scan the QR code or you'll find the link in the description. Before I get started, let's quickly summarize what a private AKS cluster is and what options we already have to access them. So here on this slide, we can see the components of a cluster. So on the left side here in red, we see the master node. That's just in simple terms the brain of our cluster. And on the right side in green, we have the worker nodes. These are the nodes that run our applications. And when we talk about making a cluster private, this means that the API of the master node will be made private. So that's the one here in blue. This is the main component of Kubernetes, I would say, because the API is used for everything. So the worker nodes use the API to communicate with the master node, but also if you use the kubectl, you also connect to the API. By default, it's available on the internet, which can be a security risk, and so it makes sense to make this API private. The downside is that it's harder to access the cluster and also harder to do your deployments. So today I want to show you how we can easily access this private API. So far, we have a couple options. The first one would be to use the Azure CLI and use the AKS command invoke command. There you have to provide your resource group name in which your AKS cluster is deployed, then the name of your AKS cluster itself, and then you can wrap your command that you want to execute. In this case, a kubectl get namespace. This works. But the downside is it's quite a lot of writing to execute one command. And it also takes between 5 and 10 seconds until you get a response from this command. So it's not very practical to use it every day. Then another options we have is to use Azure Bastion. And I already made a video about the entire setup we can see here. So I will also post a link in the description. But to quickly summarize this, what we see here on the right side is our private AKS cluster. When you deploy a private cluster, it automatically creates a private endpoint, and this private endpoint is attached to the AKS VNet. With the private endpoint, we also have here on the bottom a private DNS zone. So all of this we're going to have today as well. And then on the left side, we have here the Azure Bastion instance. Azure Bastion is a jump host. This means we can securely connect over the internet via SSH or RDP to Azure Bastion. And from Azure Bastion, we can connect somewhere else. In this case, here in the green box, back then we had to use a jump box. That's a VM. And the workflows, the developer connects through Azure Bastion to the VM, and then from the VM to AKS. Setting up everything can be quite complicated because, as you can see, there are many resources involved, and it can also be expensive because you always need your jump box, in this case a VM running, so you have to pay for the VM. The solution today will include our Azure Bastion and the private AKS cluster. We will also have a private DNS zone, but we don't have to use it, and we will get rid of this VM. This means the workflow is the developer connects to Azure Bastion, and through Azure Bastion, we can access our AKS cluster. The connection is secure, and it will also be fast. And as you will see, it will only take a couple minutes to set up everything. So when we talk about Azure Bastion, there are a couple prerequisites. The first one is we have to use Azure Bastion in the standard or premium tier. This means we can't use the developer or basic tier. And we also need the reader role on the AKS cluster, the reader role on Azure Bastion. And if we do a VNet peering, that's what we're going to do today, you also need the reader role on the AKS VNet. If we deploy Azure Bastion inside the AKS VNet, then you don't need that. Also, the AKS cluster must have the public full qualified domain enabled. By default, it's enabled, so you would have to actively deactivate it. But if you do this, the access won't work. And lastly, with Azure Bastion, the reason why we need the standard or premium tier is we need to have the native client support enabled. That's a feature in Azure Bastion, and this feature will allow us to use our native clients, for example, Windows Terminal, to access Azure Bastion. That's everything in the theory. Now let's switch over to the terminal and let's get started implementing. All right, here in the terminal, let's define a couple variables before we get started. So this is going to be the name of our AKS cluster, the resource group, the location that's closest to me, then the name of the public IP address for our Azure Bastion, the name for Azure Bastion itself, and the name of the VNet we're going to use for Azure Bastion. With this in place, now let's create a new resource group, and then we're going to deploy everything inside this resource group. Once the resource group is created, we can now create our AKS cluster. And as you can see, I deployed as simple as possible. So we have the name and the resource group. And the only important parameter is the last one here, the enable private cluster. As the name suggests, it makes the private cluster. So let's start this. This will take between 5 and 10 minutes. And once this is finished, we will continue. While this is running, as always, I have a link in the description to my GitHub. And there you can find all the code you see in the demo today. So you don't have to type anything. You can just copy and paste it. For now, I'm going to stop the video. And once the deployment is finished, we're going to continue. The AKS cluster has been deployed. And now we can continue. So let's clean this up. Next, we're going to download the credentials so we can access our cluster. Should only take a second. Now this is downloaded, we can try and access it. Let's do a kubectl get namespace. And as you can see, we get a whole bunch of error messages. That's because the API is private, therefore we can't access it. That's exactly what we wanted. Next, we can now start configuring Azure Bastion. First, I'm going to create a new public IP address. So we provide again the resource group name, then the name of the IP address. I'm using IPv4 and the standards queue, and I deploy it in the availability zone 1, 2, and 3. This means if one of the availability zone fails, for example, if number 1 fails, my IP is still available in 2 and 3. Therefore, it's highly available. Only takes a couple seconds. Now with this public IP deployed, we can create our own network. So again, it's very simple. I'm just using the same resource group. I provide the name, a location. As the address, I use a 10/16. Then for the subnet, I name it my subnet and do a 10/24. Again, only takes a couple seconds. Now the next step, we need the ID of our VNet, so we can do the VNet peering later. And to get the ID of the VNet, we can just do an easy network VNet show. Then we provide again the resource group, the VNet name, and then what we want to query for. In this case, it's the ID. Should only take us a couple seconds. And if you check this now, the VNet ID, we can see we have it now in our variable. Next, we have to create a new subnet. because Azure Bastion needs a subnet that's named Azure Bastion subnet. So what we do is we use the AC network VNet subnet create command. We provide the resource group again, the name for our VNet. Then the name for the subnet is the, as I said, Azure Bastion subnet, and then a new IP address range. In this case, 10.0.200/24. That's everything we have to prepare for our Azure Bastion. And now we can already create Azure Bastion itself. So let me paste the command and then we take a look at what this command does. So the command is called AC network bastion create. Then again, we provide all the parameters we configured so far, like the location, the name of bastion, the name of our public IP address, the resource group, the name of the VNet. Then we enable tunneling. This is the feature that allows us to use our native support. Later, I'm also going to show you how you can do this in the Azure portal. Next, I'm going to query for the ID because we are needing the ID later again for the VNet peering. And that's it. Deploying Azure Bastion takes around 10 minutes. So again, I'm going to stop the video and we'll continue once it's finished. All right, we're back. Azure Bastion has been deployed, and to test this, we can just print the ID and we can see we have one. The last step we have to configure is now the VNet peering from the VNet we just created to the AKS VNet. So we can do this in the terminal via Azure CLI or in the Azure portal. I will show you both ways because I don't get it to work with the Azure CLI. So if you have any tips how to do this, let me know. But for now, I show you how I would do it and what the error is. So first, we need the name of the AKS VNet. And to get this one, we first configure a variable. That's the name of the resource group where all the AKS resources are deployed in. This name always starts with MC underscore, then the name of the resource group you provide for the AKS cluster, underscore the name of the AKS cluster, underscore the location. You can also provide your own name during the deployment, but then you would already know the name. So for now, I just configure this variable. And with this, I can now get the ID of the AKS VNet. I think I just said name, but we actually want the ID of the VNet. So I just do an AC network VNet list in the resource group I just configured. Then I select the first result and get the ID. This works because there's only one VNet in it. If you have multiple, then you would have to query in a different way. But for now, to keep it as simple as possible, this works. And to quickly check, let's print the VNet ID, and there you can see it's the AKS VNet. All right, now let's configure the VNet peering. If you don't know what VNet peering is by default, VNets don't have access to other VNets. And with the VNet peering, we can configure this access. And what's important is the VNet is only in one direction. This means in this case, we are going to configure the VNet peering from our Bastion VNet to the AKS VNet. This means Bastion can access the AKS VNet, but we haven't configured the other way around. This means AKS can't configure Bastion. In our case, that's not necessary because we only want to go from Bastion to AKS. And the way we do this is we provide the name of our resource group, then any name for the peering, the name of our VNet, that's the Bastion VNet. Then as a remote VNet, we have to provide the ID because it's in a different resource group. That's this one. Then we configure that we allow the access. That's what we want to do. And then we complete the VNet peering. So let's execute this. It should only take a couple seconds. And then in theory, the peering should be finished. But we will switch over to the Azure portal. And there we can see it's not working as expected. here in the Azure portal, in our resource group, we have here now our VNet. If we open this, and on the left side, we select peerings. Then we can see we have one peering, but it says remote sync required, the state is initiated, and I just can't get it to work when I initiate it from the Azure CLI. So what I'm going to do now is let's delete this one. And then we're going to do the same with the Azure portal, and you will see it just works within a couple seconds. So again, if you have any idea why it's not working, I would be really happy if you could post a comment and tell me what I do wrong. So the VNet peering is gone. Now let's create a new one. Here we provide the name. That's the same name as I had before. And here we provide the VNet we want to peer to. So that's our AKS VNet. Then we want to allow the access. Then we provide the same name again for the link name. And again, we allow the access, and then we add this. It should only take a couple seconds, and then we'll see the peering has been successful. As you can see here, it's fully synchronized, connected, everything is green. So that's what we expected. This is everything we have to configure. Just to summarize, we have a private AKS cluster in one VNet. We have our Azure Bastion in a second VNet, and now we did a VNet peering from the Bastion to the AKS VNet. With this, we can now switch over to the terminal and try to access our AKS cluster. Back in the terminal, all we have to do is the AC AKS Bastion command. Then we provide the name of our AKS cluster, the resource group where it's deployed, of our Bastion. Before I said we need the ID for the VNet peering, but yeah, that was my mistake. We needed to create the tunnel. Now let's execute this. It will take a couple seconds, and then it creates a tunnel connection to the Azure Bastion. And then we can use this tunnel to connect through Azure Bastion to our private AKS cluster. The first time you execute this command, it will ask you to install the AKS preview extension. So just say yes, and after the extension is installed, it should create the tunnel connection. Now we are already connected to our private AKS cluster, and we can execute the kubectl commands the same way as to a public one. So now if I do a kubectl get namespace, then it takes a couple seconds, but it's not too slow usually. And I can see I have accessed the namespaces of my private AKS cluster. Okay, that's everything I wanted to show you. The last thing is let's switch back over to the Azure portal and let's take a look at our Azure Bastion. Back in the Azure portal, let's open Azure Bastion. And as you can see on the left side, if the menu is loading, that there are not too many configurations we can do. So the most important session is this configuration tab. And here we can have all the options we want to enable or disable. And the most important part is this one, the native client support. That's the one we enabled with the enable tunnel parameter when we deployed it via the Azure CLI. If you don't have this, you can just click it, click on apply. That will take around 10 minutes and it will add it to your Bastion instance. This is everything I wanted to show you today. So just to summarize, first we created a private AKS cluster, then we created Azure Bastion, and lastly we deployed VNet peering from the Azure Bastion VNet to the AKS VNet. With this setup, we could easily create a tunnel through Azure Bastion to our private AKS cluster and could execute kubectl commands the same way as we would do with a public cluster. The advantage of this setup is it's fast, it's not too expensive since we only have to pay for our Bastion, and if you have multiple clusters, you can reuse the same Bastion and therefore share the cost over all the clusters. Overall, having a private cluster greatly increases the security since the API is not available from the internet. But until now, it came with a couple downsides, that it might be complicated to access it. But with this Azure Bastion setup, it's very easy and almost as fast as with a public one. So I highly encourage you to try it out, to use it. And with this, I hope this was useful, and I will see you next week with a new video.